Good day, everyone. My name is John Jericho R. Jose from BIT2K, here to explain to you the basic principles and operation of an electronic fuel injected engine. But first, why is there an EFI engine? Because of a need to comply with exhaust emission regulations, the modern petrol engine requires a fuel system of extreme accuracy and long-term reliability. A correctly matched air-fuel ratio must be available at all times and at all conditions. So because of strict exhaust air emission regulations, car companies needed a new fuel system for petrol engines that would make its emission more eco-friendly and more reliable than a conventional carbureted engine, and so the EFI engines were developed. Principles of EFI. EFI is a pressurized indirect injection system that uses solenoid-operated injectors with a fixed orifice. When they are energized, fuel passes through the injector body. So it has a similar approach to a fuel system of a diesel engine, but instead of a injector pump, the fuel injector is controlled by a solenoid to inject the fuel inside the manifold. Multi-point injection injects fuel into the intake ports just upstream of each cylinder's intake valve. This is one of many types of EFI layout for a petrol engine, but I believe this is the most common on sedan cars today. An electronic control unit, also known as ECU, opens the injector by pulsing their electrical current, then spray fuel in each port directly in front of each intake valve. Fuel leaving the nozzle is atomized and it mixes with the air also entering the system to form a combustible mixture. So unlike the carburetor in which through the vacuum of the manifold, the fuel is sucked inside the intake manifold to mix with the air. For the mixture, EFI atomizes the fuel as it mixes with the air going inside the air intake valve. Fuel pressure is kept at a constant valve above manifold pressure, so that the amount of fuel injected is determined only by the length of time the injector held open by the ECU. This is called the pulse width of the injector. Now, pulse width of the injector is a pretty complicated topic, but to simplify things, it is the duration of how long the fuel injector must be open. This could be determined if the engine is in a cold start, or the mixture is becoming too lean or too rich, and if the idle speed needs to be raised if a load is applied to the engine. Example is the air conditioning compressor. So as you can see in the GIF, this is a cold start pulse width with approximately 30 milliseconds of open, and after it warms up into normal operating temperature, it drops down to 8 milliseconds. The trigger signal to operate the injectors can be supplied from the ignition system or from crank angle sensors on the crankshaft or the camshaft. Engine fuel requirements change according to engine speed, load, and temperature. So you can see again in this GIF, this is the ignition system, crank angle, and the camshaft angle is right around here. And it all flows back to the ECU. So the ECU needs information on these changes. Sensor measures this variable, then relay the information to the ECU in the form of electrical signals. The ECU then calculates the duration of pulses necessary to provide the fuel required. Operation of an EFI engine. The gas pedal in your car is connected to the throttle valve. This is the valve that regulates how much air enters the engine. When you step on the gas pedal, the throttle valve opens up more, letting in more air. The ECU sees the throttle valve open and increase the fuel rate in anticipation of more air entering the engine. So this is what the throttle body looks like, and it also looks like the throttle body plate of a carburetor. It is more important to increase the fuel rate as soon as the throttle valve opens. Otherwise, when the gas pedal is first pressed, there may be a hesitation as some air reaches the cylinder without enough fuel in it. Sensors monitor the mass of air entering the engine as well as the amount of oxygen in the exhaust. The ECU uses this information to fine-tune the fuel delivery so that the air-to-fuel ratio is just right. ECU sensors. The mass airflow sensor tells the ECU the mass of air entering the engine. Oxygen sensors monitors the amount of oxygen in the exhaust so the ECU can determine how rich or lean the fuel mixture is and makes adjustments accordingly. So the mass airflow sensor is the one that is responsible for telling the ECU how much air is flowing in the intake manifold for the fuel injectors to compensate the fuel mixture inside the intake manifold, while the oxygen sensor are usually by pair. Tell the ECU if the air-fuel mixture is too lean or too rich, unlike in carburetors in which you need to tune up the carb for the engine to run efficiently. Throttle position sensor monitors the throttle valve position, which determines how much air goes into the engine, so the ECU can respond quickly to changes, increasing or decreasing the fuel rate as necessary. And as you can see, the mass airflow sensor is usually beside or in front of the throttle position sensor. Both of these sensors tell the ECU how much air is entering and flowing inside the intake manifold to increase or decrease fuel rates. Coolant temperature sensor allows the ECU to determine when the engine has reached its proper operating temperature. The manual temperature sensor of the engine is the thermostat, but the sensor used by the ECU uses the coolant temperature sensor to sense if the engine is in proper operating temperature. Voltage sensors monitors the system voltage in the car so the ECU can raise the idle speed if voltage is dropping, which will indicate a high electrical load. Manifold absolute pressure sensor monitors the pressure of the air in the intake manifold. The amount of air being drawn into the engine is a good indication of how much power it is producing, and the more air that goes in the engine, the lower the manifold pressure. So the reading is used to gauge how much power is being produced. If you have heard the term MAP, this is the meaning of it. Manifold absolute pressure. It's like I have said, the component in which the ECU can maximize the reading from the engine to use its full power. And this is usually only edited by engine tuners since the factory settings are the most optimal setting in the car's engine. This is what the manifold looks like. Engine speed sensor monitors engine speed, which is one of the factors used to calculate the pulse width. So the engine speed sensor is just like the tachometer in your gauge panel, but this engine speed sensor is different because it is connected to the ECU. Operation of a EFI engine, fuel system. This is the part in which we study the components that pressurizes the fuel injectors. Fuel tank stores the fuel and the fuel pump assembly and fuel sensor. Fuel pump assembly usually holds the fuel pump filter and fuel sensor. Excuse me. Fuel pump assembly usually holds the fuel pump filter and the fuel sensor. Fuel pump sends pressure to the fuel system up to the pressure regulator. Fuel sensor tells the fuel level on your tank. So the fuel sensor is pretty self-explanatory, and fuel pump, it's the one that sends pressure to your fuel injectors. And why I've said fuel pump assembly, because usually most of the modern cars today, fuel gauge sending unit and the fuel pump are already integrated. That's why it's an assembly. But since this picture they are separate, I still separated their uses. Fuel filter filters the fuel before it returns to the tank from the fuel return line. So in this diagram, I have seen that the fuel filter is routed to return to the fuel tank, but in some diagrams, I have seen that the fuel filter is filtering fuel going and returning back to the tank. So just a little information. Pressure regulator regulates the pressure needed by the fuel injectors in the given moment. So fuel pressure regulator is the one that makes sure that the fuel rail is not overly pressurized and relieves some of the pressure if needed or increases the pressure if needed also. Delivery pipe. Consisting of a feed and return pipe, delivery pipes are the ones that connects the fuel rail to the tank of a car. So as you can see in the diagram, again, this is the fuel pump. This is the delivery pump going into the fuel regulator. And after passing through the fuel regulator, it goes to the fuel rail, sorry, fuel rail, and then in the fuel injectors. And then the return line, it passes through the fuel filter and returns back the tank where it can be cycled again. Fuel rail supplies pressurized fuel to all of the injectors, mounted on top of the injector body to feed the injector on the pressurized fuel. So this is what a fuel rail looks like. Just a straight rail. This is where the feed goes in and the return valve goes to. Return line, I mean, sorry. Fuel injector. By this point, I think you know what fuel injectors do. They inject the fuel. That's what we have been talking about for the past 12 minutes. That is all. Thank you for listening.